spoke about the losses.
So I'm going to take a chance that this is all up to us now. You are listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. I'll be here for the next hour, bringing you up to date with what's happened since last Tuesday. Most of you do not need this. Most of you are very studious in your own regard, in your ability to keep track of what's going on. But I have to admit, with the heat we have been putting up with lately, and it's no different than any other July, I'm just not as resilient against the heat as I was a year ago. And it has a way of very limiting my behavior, and I suppose yours to some degree as well. All right, so let's, with excuses aside, let's get started here. Now, the United States, since we last talked, struck Iran for the 8th consecutive night on from July 18th to 20th. CENTCOM claimed its targets were coastal surveillance, air defense facilities, maritime capabilities, and missile and drone storage. However, the actual targets tell another story. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization reported that on July 19th, that U.S. projectiles hit the under construction Darkovin nuclear power plant, which is a civilian power station, which the IAEA confirmed was under active inspection before the recent aggressive U.S.-Israeli war against Iran began back in February. And so the day before, U.S. strikes damaged a water desalination plant in Jask, Iran, cutting off water to 10,000 people. Now that's a war crime. That's an absolute war crime. Suppose somehow a foreign nation that we had attacked first and was responding to us completely destroyed the water supply to Salt Lake County, so that there was no water flowing into Salt Lake County. How would you respond to that? Some of you have stored water. But one thing that's different between here and Iran right now is Iran is dealing with 50 degrees centigrade temperatures. Now you can use your little smartphone to convert that. It's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know that Phoenix ever got to 122 degrees. Do you know what it's like to be in that? I was in 121 degrees once in Phoenix. It's unbelievable. And if we take out their power stations and we take out their desalination plants, to what end? The needless but intentional suffering of innocent people in the most horrible ways to die. Water dehydration at 120 degree temperatures. That's a war crime. Now, these developments come only days after President Trump had told Fox News just last week. He said this: we're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate. If Iran doesn't make a deal, you're not going to have anybody left. Now, is that any way for the president of a country to speak, to talk? One thing is certain. He says that they want to come. We want the Iranians to come to the table and negotiate. Who's going to trust any negotiation from the United States? Who's going to trust any document that has President Trump's signature on it? I mean, the MOU now is, a thing of the past, an obvious example of fraud on the part of the U.S. State Department and the White House. Who would trust anything that we signed? And so this kind of logic coming from the Oval Office kind of implies an escalation ladder that once begun is very hard to reverse. I don't know if you saw Iran's answer to all of this Saturday night, but they said something to the effect, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, their response will be on a level unimaginable. Iran's response to a full-scale attack by Israel and the United States again against Iran will result in consequences unimaginable. So following these increasing strikes on the Iranian civilian infrastructure, Kuwait has now reported damage to one of its power generation and desalination facilities for the second time in 2 days. And this is a region where most freshwater supplies come from desalination. Now, nor is any of this going well for our country. CENTCOM has confirmed that the unidentified remains were recovered at the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, where 2 American service members were killed by an Iranian missile strike, and a third has been missing since. Now, the numbers that the Eastern press are reporting of American dead far exceeds the numbers that Western media is reporting. And apparently a 4th service member was killed in northern Iraq on July 18th during a controlled detonation of ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. As pointed out in an article in the Wall Street Journal, these events point to the painful reality that Iranian missile capabilities are far more advanced than previously thought. So where is all of this leading? Well, according to Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, and I'm going to get into more of what Mr. Parsi has had to say, but he said that Washington and Tehran are arriving independently at the same conclusion, that diplomacy is finished, and that only the military exhaustion of the other side can change anything. And he names the hardening on both sides for what it is. He says it's not an adjustment to reality. It's a profound failure of imagination and statecraft. And if that failure is not answered, as Iran said last Saturday night, no one is exempt from the consequences. Because if this conflict continues, and it has every likelihood that it will, with the prolonged bottleneck of the Strait of Hormuz, this could easily throw the world economy into a depression. Not to mention the initiation of a war between nuclear powers. Because of this, the effects of this crisis, I think without exaggeration, is reaching every country on this planet, which makes every country an indirect party to it, whether it wishes to be a party to it or not. As Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in a conference meeting this last weekend, we're all sitting in one boat. And she noted that one factor which could play a major role today is if the international community raises their voice much, much more because they are de facto an indirect partner in the situation, it might help. But the danger is not confined to the Gulf, obviously. On July 19, drones struck two oil tankers at the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's terminal near Novorossiysk. This followed Russia's overnight assault on Kyiv and Odessa, among the largest of the war, which itself followed Ukraine's massive strike on Russian retail distribution warehouses that killed 8 and wounded more than 60. And this region also threatens to expand far beyond its borders, including into Ukraine's supporters in Europe. As Lavrov has repeated again recently, we know where these missiles are being built, and he was not referring to Ukraine. And then against all of this horror and death and destruction, on July 18th in the courtyard of the Apostolic Palace at Castel Gandolfo, where Pope Leo XIV was honored with a concert of Paganini and Bellini, the world is filled with ugliness, the Pope acknowledged. Wars, violence. But he said this. He says, but yet things of beauty that remind us that there is more than all of this. It reminds us that men and women, when we choose to, can join together to reveal a beauty that from heart to heart helps us to see and lift our gaze toward heaven. What a contrast. What a contrast of voices and noise. Because in other words, Pope Leo is asserting that humanity is something other than what the war planners have assured us to be. And it is the only ground which the dead-end Parsi describes can actually be exited. Because one thing we don't want to fail here is to look at the moral factor behind what's going on. I mean, we can draw up all kinds of ideas and stories and scenarios and say that this is going to be the outcome. But through this unprovoked war of aggression, 2 times now by Israel and the United States against Iran, who did not provoke this with anything that they did in the first place, the world opinion is, as you probably are well aware and have seen yourself, has dramatically shifted. But I would not underestimate this as a very big factor in what's coming next. Because I think the world population is clearly shifting in a way that's going to have severe consequences down the road, as more and more nations refuse to support the United States and Israel in what they're doing. So we struck Iran for an 8th consecutive night here this last weekend, allegedly in retaliation for the deaths of 2 U.S. service members in Jordan. And the strikes targeted, according to CENTCOM, the strikes targeted military, coastal surveillance and air defense facilities, maritime capabilities, and missile and drone storage sites to continue degrading Iranian military capabilities. And then Secretary of War, which he wants to call it, Pete Hegseth, said of the death of the service members that their sacrifice only stiffens our resolve, which of course is what you'd expect him to say. However, strikes against civilian infrastructure in Iran appear to be increasing, even if it's not admitted to publicly. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization said U.S. forces struck the under construction Darkovin nuclear power plant in Khuzestan province. And in a statement released July 19th, the AEOI said, quote, the terrorist and criminal U.S. regime, whose nature consists of nothing but bullying and lawlessness, carried out an aggressive and brutal attack in violation of international law. It struck the plant with a number of projectiles, a sight it called one of the symbols of Iranian's nation's dignity and scientific self-sufficiency. Construction on this plant began back in 2022. And it was further noted that the IAEA announced it was reviewing reports on the strike, but it didn't name any party as responsible for the attack. It noted that the facility did not yet contain any nuclear material as of its last inspection and posed no radiological risk. And this follows reports from July 18th, the day before, that the U.S. hit a desalination plant in Jask, Iran, cutting off water supplies to 20 villages and 10,000 people. Now, what do you do if you're one of these 10,000 people and in the midst of 120 daily high temperatures, where it might get down to 105 at night, and you don't have any water to drink. Damage has now been reported at a Kuwaiti power generation and water desalination for the second time in 2 days. Kuwait's Ministry of Electricity, Water, and Renewable Energy said in a statement that attacks sparked a fire, forcing a large number of generation units offline, and Iran has not yet confirmed these attacks on Kuwait, that they were from them. So Trump's threats, an apparent decision to target Iran's infrastructure, aside from being a fuse for a wider war, could quickly lead to disaster across this region, whose population relies heavily on desalination of water for daily needs. I saw one report that said that anybody involved in soldiering, whether it's U.S. Israeli forces or Iranian IRGC or Iranian army forces, whatever, carrying 40 to 60 to 80 pound rucksacks or backpacks or whatever you call them, in that kind of heat, requires anywhere from 8 to 12 liters of water a day to survive that kind of condition. Now, Trita Parsi, who I've quoted many times, the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, warned last Thursday in an analysis on Substack that the U.S. and Iran are each independently arriving at the same dangerous conclusion: that diplomacy is no longer possible, and that only further military exhaustion of the other side can change the equation. As I said there at the beginning of the program, Iran is not going to trust anything the West has to say. And Iran is not going to sit down in some diplomatic meeting knowing that as soon as their location is identified, Israel and the U.S. will kill the diplomats, as we have twice before already. So they're not about to sit down and talk about this. Iranian answers to requests or demands from the West for total surrender is going to be answered by their missiles. And some of the experts that I listen to that I trust, like Doug McGregor, who should be the Secretary of Defense right now, said Iran still has thousands of missiles at their disposal. And Alastair Crooke, that I was listening to this morning, a former British diplomat and military strategist, said that the condition, well, he just finished an article called Iran War 3.0. So there have been two. Since February 28th, we've attacked Iran twice in full-scale war. Now the question is Trump going to attack Iran a third time? And when you look at the political situation going on in Israel, here you have a very sick prime minister, Netanyahu, allegedly from prostate cancer and whatever other conditions. Just looking at him in up-to-date video, you can see the man is quite sick. He's lost a lot of weight. How long is he going to survive? Because unless he stays on as prime minister, he will probably, the judgments of the court are hanging over his head that'll put him in jail the rest of his life, unless the president pardons him, as Trump constantly is trying to get the president of Israel to do. Or is he going to continue on advancing the concepts of greater Israel and stay fighting man to man in Lebanon, continuing to take over more and more illegal territory in the West Bank, restart the battle in Gaza, and launch a third war against Iran? I mean, it's almost too much to believe. Parsi says in this article, in the Substack article, in view of Tehran believing that as long as Washington retains the option of returning to war, negotiations serve very little purpose since the U.S. will always be tempted to improve its position through force when available. So Parsi cited Supreme Leader Mujtaba Khamenei comment on July 18th that Trump's conduct has proven that the, quote, the signature of the U.S. president is utterly worthless and devoid of credibility. Now, on the U.S. side, Parsi's arguing that Trump has concluded that Tehran's stubbornness, as Trump calls it, stems from Washington not having hit Iran hard enough during the earlier 38-day war, and is now hoping that a few more weeks of renewed strikes will degrade Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz and force its hand. And Parsi calls this, at best, he says, a perilous gamble, and one that is seemingly indifferent to the costs of the Gulf states, the global economy, and U.S. troops. It seems that way, doesn't it? The further this thing progresses, the less concern there seems to be for U.S. service members. And because Iran's precisely delivered missiles and drones can penetrate American defenses, as we have recently seen in Kuwait, what's the point? Because if this dynamic has not changed, it only spells disaster for this entire region and the world more generally. And Parsi calls this, he says, it's not an adjustment to reality. It's a profound failure of imagination and statecraft. So right now you have Iran fighting for its very right to exist. That concept isn't present in the American mindset. We're not fighting for our right to exist. We're not fighting some defensive position against a nuclear power coming against us with regular daily and nightly attacks against our infrastructure. Iran is in an existential crisis of the first order. And right now, Paul Musgrave from the Georgetown University in Qatar said this: right now you're looking at an unpopular and increasingly costly war, and this historically has meant pressure for the United States to get out of that war. And of course, this is Iran's position. The only way they will stop their attacks is not just for the U.S. and Israel to stop their attacks on Iran, but for the U.S. military to get the hell out of the Middle East. Shut down your bases, take your airplanes and your refuelers, your helicopters, your A-10 Warthogs that fire the Hellfires, pull out your Navy, and get out of the Middle East. Paul Musgrave told Al Jazeera, severe criticism is mounting not only from the Democratic Party of the United States, but also from the right of the political spectrum. And the asymmetry, he said, is the central factor now of this conflict. Think about that. It's easy to get caught up in the war crimes that the U.S. is committing against the Iranian population. But what's going on in this country right now? What's going on in the political mindset of the citizenry who are, this is the middle of July, August, September, October, 4 months away from the midterms. Because he said this, Musgrave said this: since February, the asymmetry on how interests have been conducted has been clear. The regime in Tehran is fighting an existential war. The United States and Israel are fighting a war over policy choices. He says the U.S. attacks have been tremendously affecting the ordinary lives of Iranians living in the south of the country in particular. Several bridges have been hit, in addition to railways, tunnels, airports, and roads. We've seen some hospitals being evacuated, exams in their schools being postponed, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure is significantly limiting the movement of people, goods, and logistical supplies. He says the U.S. is trying to degrade the IRGC's capacity, but these infrastructures are also used by civilians. Americans are trying to isolate the south of the country from the rest of Iran. To what end? Iran is not going to surrender. As Musgrave says, as many other commentators and writers have said, Iran is not going to stop. They will continue their attacks in defense of the attacks given against them. And due to the fact that Iran can penetrate American air defenses in Kuwait to take out vital airfield areas and defense positions in Kuwait, shows that Iran can probably do a lot worse to Israel should this war start up again. Now, after the July 17th death of 2 American service members during an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. base in Jordan, CENTCOM announced that a 3rd individual remains missing, though remains have been found at the site that have not been identified. You know, they could be a lot more grisly in their report here, because apparently one person was killed trying to defuse an unexploded Iranian drone. If that thing exploded in the face of this weapons expert, I don't know that you'd find anything that you could identify. I mean, that just, it's very disturbing to me to have to say that stuff. But CENTCOM says, yeah, we've got some remains that haven't been identified. CENTCOM also said this, and it's on X, it's a statement on X. After a thorough search, U.S. military personnel found unidentified remains at the location earlier today. An examination process is to verify the remains, which is ongoing. I mean, that's just absolutely horrible. This probably was not a stranger to the fellow servicemen he was working with, or she was working with, yet they can't identify it. Because there's no face left? Separately, the statement goes on saying this: a 4th serviceman, U.S. serviceman, a service member, not serviceman, was killed in northern Iraq on July 18th during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. A 2nd was wounded. So I've got these 2 backwards. Now, what about Russia and the Ukraine? Russia continues to increase its attacks on Ukraine's military-related infrastructure, as it launched an overnight attack July 18th, 19th, using missiles, drones, aerial bombs. Many are calling one of the largest assaults since the war in Ukraine began in 2022. Russia's Ministry of Defense said this in a post, that the strikes were against defense industry enterprises and logistics centers in Kyiv and the Kyiv region, and against infrastructure facilities at the Yuzhny port in Odessa region, used for the delivery and storage of military cargo, petroleum, oil, lubricants intended to support the armed forces of the Ukraine. The statement claimed that the strikes targeted facilities where Ukraine's the UK modeled Flamingo missiles, but they're in Ukraine, but they were made by the UK. And other munitions involved in long-range strikes into Russia are produced. Ukraine's Air Force reported that Russia launched 41 missiles, 25 of them ballistic, along with 125 attack drones, claiming that they intercepted or suppressed 18 of the missiles and 108 of the drones. And around Odessa, it's reported that Russia also struck the Odessa and Yuzhny ports as part of the increased assault there. So the attack came a day after Ukraine's own large-scale drone strikes on 2 warehouses in Russia owned by an online retailer, Wildberries, which killed 8, wounded more than 60. This is unusual for Russia to respond within 24 hours of an attack. Usually they wait several days, if not weeks, before they have a response. This was within 24 hours. And the Ukrainian acting president, Zelensky, claimed the facilities held components there that are used to make drones. It's an interesting thing to come out and admit, isn't it? Now, Wildberries, spelled just like it sounds, Wildberries, is Russia's largest online retailer, often referred to as the equivalent of Amazon. And according to the Russian immigrant website Meduza and the Russian Telegram channels, preliminary estimates put the damage at more than 50 billion rubles, which is about 640 million US, and as much as 15% of the company's warehouse space was destroyed. Now, there's a strong response from within Russia to the escalation. I keep watching this because I think it has an awful lot to do with how long Russia's going to do tit for tat and not start getting really serious about this. But there's a strong report from within Russia. Grigory Karasin, who's the senior diplomat who is now chairman of the Federation's Council's Committee on International Affairs, called the attack on Wildberries a disgrace, vowing that Russia's response is going to be prompt and resolute. And the increasing attacks on civilian infrastructure by Kyiv is evidence that these malicious attacks and deliberately aiming at socially vital infrastructure with drones, attempting to sow chaos among our citizens. He says this is the true face of modern Nazism, dividing society and fostering instability. So you kind of wonder how long this is going to continue back and forth. Now, looking at the U.S. perspective right now, there, with these reports of 2 military people in the U.S. being killed in Jordan, and the retaliatory measures by the Iranian side, we have seen the kind of statements which have come from the president's office himself. Also, Pete Hegseth saying that has just strengthened the resolve of the U.S. against the Iranians. Considering the strategic objectives, with the U.S. continuing its nightly strikes for the 8th consecutive night this weekend. I mean, you kind of wonder, with all these nightly strikes taking place, when is the third wave, the third war against Iran going to break out? Well, it doesn't make any sense because it does not strengthen the position of the United States, even in the medium time, to continue these nightly attacks, because the international public opinion is turning very massively against our country and against Israel. Because I think most people understand that it's not really something organic to the United States. It's the pressure of Israel on President Trump. that the Trump administration is doing what it's doing. And I think the mood of the world public is absolutely turning around. There was a recent poll by the Pew Research Center. They polled 35 countries. Only 9 of them voted for the U.S. and 26 voted for China, being more in public favor. Which one do you favor more as far as their international policies and statecraft is concerned? Of the 35, 9 said the U.S., the rest of them voted for China. And I think the United States, under the pressure of Israel, simply, obviously wants to degrade the military capacity of Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz. And every time Hegseth says something, this only strengthens our resolve. What do you think the resolve of the Iranian people happens to be? 40 million turned out for the funeral of Ali Khamenei. And they were in the public. And some of them were carrying signs addressed to the United States saying, "Here we are." Well, I think, in my opinion, for whatever authority I have or don't have, Iran has the absolute right to control the Strait of Hormuz. At least they're half of it. Oman has the right to control the other half. Speaking of international waters. And it's the fault of our country, because before we started these two wars, the Strait of Hormuz was the site of the U.S. unprovoked war of aggression against Iran, that the strait is no longer free. It was free and wide open before February 28th. And I think if this continues much longer, not only obviously the incredible pain that's being inflicted on the Iranian population, I mean, you have 8 days of relentless bombarding, not only of military installations over the last 8 days, but obviously hitting bridges and schools being closed down, hospitals being evacuated, energy being cutting back, and then, of course, the desalination plant that was hit, stopping the flow of fresh water to 10,000 people in Iran. So I think the damage and suffering inflicted on Iran is incredible. And I don't think that's going to change the resolve of the Iranian people to continue this war, because for them it's a war of existence. You know, where do most of the Islamic terrorists come from in the Middle East? Terrorists in the sense of Western description. To a large degree, they're the children of murdered parents, or brothers, or uncles, or cousins. Now, if we try to understand Iranian strategy at this point in time, since this particular conflict began in the form of war, there were a lot of voices who were of the view that prolonging this war as much as it's been prolonged, it would eventually favor Iran because of the asymmetry of this very warfare. Because we, the West, the United States and Israel, are running out of weaponry. And the best experts that I listen to, experts in my opinion, but not just mine, but worldwide recognition, say that Iran has thousands of missiles left. Ever since the overthrow of the Shah and the establishment of the Islamic theocracy in Iran 47 years ago, they have been building missiles and underground facility storages, reinforced concrete underground military storage facilities. And that the only thing that could reach them is a tactical nuke. because even now their uranium upgrading for hospital use is 100 meters underground. That's a football field. Excuse me. Yeah, 100 meters. That's longer than the U.S. football field underground. And the only thing that's going to reach that is a tactical nuke. So at this time, in the resumption of these strikes, and tonight might be the 9th day in a row, the deterrence that this is supposed to be creating, like somehow the Iranian population is going to finally say to their leaders, surrender, surrender. And I already said that it seems the resolve is not going to be reduced, at least on the Iranian side. So what is exactly at this point in time Iranian strategy? I mean, is it working in favor of Iran? So I think that the demands which have been made by Iran include a very stable perspective for stability in that region, which from their standpoint would require, as I said earlier, the U.S. leave the region altogether. Now, obviously, this is not what Israel wants, and it's not what the United States wants. But I think the situation is very fragile at this moment, given the fact that the Gulf cooperation countries are now massively being hit as well, especially the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Even this desalination plant in Kuwait has been hit in retaliation to a desalination hit in Iran. Why did they pick a desalination plant in Kuwait when they could have taken out all the desalination plants at the Fifth Fleet headquarters? Fifth Fleet. I don't know. But for some of these Gulf countries, that means the basis for their existence is put into question now. Because some of these countries require 70, 80, 90% of their water from desalination. And if Iran takes out the rest of these countries will no longer exist. And when you see a city like Doha, as modern looking as it is, the vast majority of its water comes from desalination. And Iran is threatening to take that out if they are further attacked by the United States and Israel. What does this boil down to? Some of these countries may, and I would say the same thing for Israel, if they start a third war against Iran, Israel will cease to exist. So I think Iran is probably trying to use what's been said many times, and I think Iran may have been the one that said it, that their control of the Strait of Hormuz is the equivalent of using a nuclear bomb on the side of Iran. And I think they're definitely determined to keep control of the Strait of Hormuz and drive the United States out of the region. Now, in the short term, this is a very dangerous escalation because Trump isn't going to leave. If Trump leaves and has to admit defeat, there may be no Republican Party left in the two houses of Congress come midterms. Well, January 3rd of 2027. Now, the State Department, you may have seen this. I got a little news blip about it. The State Department just put out, this is yesterday, the U.S. State Department put out a global travel warning for all American citizens abroad because they expect a worsening of the situation in the Middle East. Now, I haven't asked my son if he heard about this, but my youngest son, Rourke, some of you know him, and his wife, Andrea, live in Valencia, Spain. And she has to come back to the country to finish her citizenship. Interestingly enough, you can be a citizen of Spain and a citizen of the United States. They just announced their pregnancy, which I presume is going to be my last grandchild, a little boy. And he is, my son, an American citizen, and would come under this envelope of the U.S. State Department because it said all Americans should come home wherever you are. That came from the U.S. State Department yesterday to the whole world. If you're an American citizen, you should come home. So the younger ones can be drafted? Is this just more hyperbole coming from the U.S. government about our superiority in the world? Because the State Department essentially said, in so many words, a worsening of the situation in the Middle East. Does that mean that any minute Iran War 3.0, as Alistair Crook calls it, could break out? Yeah. And there are reports that Israeli planes are now being refueled again by the United States refuelers. And there was a certain amount of time where Israel was very much quiet regarding their own Air Force. But now the word is coming out. The Israeli jets are back up in the air, and they've been in the air because of these nightly raids, but they are being refueled by U.S. refuelers. So I'm kind of afraid we're looking in the short term as possible escalation. And given the fact that the aim of the United States is to eliminate the nuclear capacity of Iran, because you can't mention the word Iran in front of President Trump without him saying they can't have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to let them have a nuclear weapon. We'll do everything to stop them from having a nuclear weapon. Our major resolve is to stop nuclear weapon development in Iran. Of course, he didn't say it quite like that. And given the fact that this is what the United States seems to have emboldened on every news release, as I said, the nuclear capacity of Iran, I don't know where it's at right now. There are different reports. You know, there was this fatwa back in 1983 from Ali Khamenei, no nuclear weapons, because this is adverse to Allah and the teachings of the Quran. We will not create a weapon of this nature. And that fatwa has been in place. Now he's assassinated and gone back in the beginning of March. And the son, Moshtaba Khamenei, the rumors was that he may have reversed this. But the big talk right now is that Iran is indicating they might pull out of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, which the United States is not a member of, and Israel is not a member of. But Iran is. And their nuclear facilities, as far as the development of 60% enrichment, which is necessary for their medical use of radiation, has been under open inspection of the IAEA for years. And now they stopped it. They told the IAEA to hit the road. Now, the only way you can get to the nuclear development going on in Iran and stop it, short of a tactical nuke, is ground troops. And there's all this talk of some 50,000 U.S. troops immediately deployable into Iran through the Gulf Coast countries, across the Gulf, coming in through Kuwait, help from Kurdistan or the Kurds, but Iran has been taking out the Kurds with their targets too. It's impossible to have 50,000 troops put into Iran. They would be, as it is said, sitting ducks. And they're not all fighting forces. One estimate I saw of the 50,000 possible troops is that 10,000 at the most are fighting Marines, an army. Now, as I said earlier, the heat is absolutely detrimental to any kind of ground deployment, which again leaves only one option: a tactical nuclear weapon. And I'm extremely concerned that that's where we're headed. Even a prolongation to, it's about to throw the world economy into a depression because of the closing down of the strait. But it seems to me that given the outcome and the effects of this crisis is affecting every single country on this planet. And then what would be required is that the international community is raising their voice more and more and more, because they are de facto an indirect partner in this situation, which is why there is a cry now for a General Assembly of the UN to get together to do something about this. And when you look at the crisis that the Strait of Hormuz is facing right now, and this threat of the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, you kind of have to ask yourself, what's the chances of that? Is Trump so locked into the people who are lying to him on a daily basis that their insistence that this be done have any likely implications that it might actually be carried out? Now, there's a parliamentarian in the Iranian parliament at the beginning of July who said that if the attack should resume, then Iran might review its nuclear doctrine and leave the nuclear proliferation treaty, as I said. And given the fact that the nuclear doctrine of Iran so far is to not have a nuclear weapon, because this was, as I said, contrary to the existing fatwa, which said that nuclear weapons are an open contradiction to the faith of Islam. So it was clearly a non-nuclear doctrine, and changing that can only mean to go in the direction of acquiring nuclear weapons on the Iranian side. And the American nuclear scientist Ted Postel, who I've quoted many times in the last several years, said in some recent statements, and he's one of the top experts in the world of nuclear war, that would only take Iran maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks to take their 60% to weapons-grade fuel. And given the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, it's not completely ununderstandable that Iran would try to acquire nuclear weapons, given the fact that they have been attacked now 2 times unprovoked, and that, for example, North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, has avoided being attacked. South Korea has made no attempt to attack North Korea because they know North Korea has nukes. So this question is, clearly hanging in the air. And Kennedy, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, reflecting on his dialogues with Khrushchev, basically said the one thing that he learned, that both of them actually learned, Kennedy said, was that no one should ever box a major nuclear power into a corner where they have no other way out except to use their weapons. So we're in a very dangerous proximity here as we're coming towards the end of the show, which is why I think it does require a different approach, because if the United States is just doing what they're doing, and the United States goes on doing just what the United States has been doing, it affects the entire world. And all the other countries, the non-aligned movement, the BRICS countries, the Europeans, Latin Americans, Global South, all of these countries should be speaking out and making their voice heard, because if it accelerates this way, and I hope I'm wrong, but if it accelerates and gets down to the use of nukes, all bets are off. We will be in uncharted waters at that point. And the consequence could be carried by all of humanity. So there has to be a UN Security Special Emergency Session, or even a UN General Assembly. And I think the situation is so dangerous that people in countries should make their voice heard, because we're all sitting, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said, we're all sitting in one boat. And based on the studies, once you use one nuclear weapon, the danger is that all weapons in existence could be used, which of course would be the end of our civilization. So I think, Trump is caught thinking about this, thinking about the third term. He's clearly threatening the well-being of you and me with these increasing fuel prices. Apparently in the Salt Lake area, diesel's back up to $5 a gallon. And even though the United States is making tremendously huge profits right now in the sale of liquid nitrogen gas, natural gas, nevertheless, for the average American, life is becoming much more expensive. And for the Europeans, the consequences are just massive. So this is the end of the program. I wanted to say something more about our 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. I went to see Young Washington over the weekend. Wow, what a movie. I highly recommend it. It was very well done. I've studied to some degree Washington's life. I don't see anybody criticizing the accuracy or fact-checking that would indicate anything in there wasn't based on actual events. But it was a great movie. I hope they've got a sequel coming to it, middle-aged Washington. But this was very good. This is how he got started, from what would be considered lower class Virginia culture society, because he just wasn't the upper class. He was hardly anything more than a farmer. And how he ended up the general, or at least I think the colonel of the Virginia militia by the end of the movie. I highly recommend it, Young Washington. So I'm going to stop the recording so that I can save it, and then I've got to get something playing back up to where it was before. I'll find something else here. And for those of you on the stream, thank you for your attention. If you can like and subscribe, and you think somebody might be benefited by this program today, please share it with them. And I will